first presentation will introduce the concept of pro-life for the whole life, which is the theme for this conference and also for Democrats for Life as a whole. Our speaker is John Whitehead. He is the president of the Consistent Life Network, which is an international coalition that promotes a consistent ethic of reverence for life and works against every form of socially approved killing. He is a deputy editor and contributor for Life Matters Journal, the magazine of Humanize International, and he has degrees from the University of Chicago and George Washington University. Please welcome John Whitehead.
Good evening, everyone. I'm here to speak on being pro-life for the whole life. What does it mean to be pro-life for the whole life? At its simplest, to be pro-life for the whole life means to respect and care about every human life, from conception to natural death, without exception. It means to protect human life from the many forms of violence that threaten it, to destroy it, even when those forms of violence are legally or socially approved. It means to recognize the violent death of any other human being as a tragedy, something to be mourned, something that ought to prompt us to ask, how could this have been prevented? To be pro-life for the whole life also means to protect human life, not only from overt violence and direct killing, but also from the subtler threats to human life, the more indirect ways people's lives are diminished and ended too soon. Poverty is a very big and obvious example of this. Racism is another. Racism can, of course, lead all too easily to direct killing. This is a subject that's been very much in the news and on all of our minds recently. But it can destroy people's lives in subtler, more indirect ways too. A famous Democratic politician of the last century, Robert F. Kennedy, spoke eloquently on these subtler threats to life. He said, "There is another kind of violence, slower but just as deadly, destructive as the shot or the bomb in the night. This is the violence of institutions, indifference and inaction and slow decay. This is the violence that afflicts the poor, that poisons relations between men because their skin has different colors. This is the slow destruction of a child by hunger, and schools without books, and homes without heat in the winter. And today we might add it's the destruction of children in cages in the summertime." To be pro-life for the whole life means to stand against these many forms of violence. To be pro-life for the whole life means to look at other human beings and to see them as human beings, not as products of conception, not as enemy combatants or collateral damage, not as criminals who are really just animals or scum, not as bums or trailer trash or all those other dehumanizing terms. Human beings. It means to see them as human beings. Last, and this is something we can easily forget, but it's very important, to be pro-life for the whole life means being aware of how the different threats to life are connected to one another. Poverty and racism are connected to abortion and help foster it. The same is true of another type of discrimination, discrimination against the disabled. Ableism also contributes to abortion. Poverty and racism are connected to the death penalty. Ableism is connected to assisted suicide and euthanasia. These are just some of the connections among the threats to life and ways in which the different ways of defending life are also connected. This notion of being pro-life for the whole life goes by a number of different names or labels. One of them is the Consistent Life Ethic. I serve as the president of an organization, the Consistent Life Network, that is dedicated to promoting the Consistent Life Ethic. Our mission statement reads as follows. We are a network of organizations and individuals committed to the protection of life, which is threatened in today's world by war, abortion, poverty, racism, the death penalty, and euthanasia. We believe that these issues are linked under a consistent ethic of life. We challenge those working on all or some of these issues to maintain a cooperative spirit of peace, reconciliation, and respect in protecting the unprotected. That's the mission of the Consistent Life Network, and this mission guides what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Consistent Life Network as an organization, and I'm going to talk about some of the different interpretations, some of the different understandings of what it means to be an advocate for the consistent life ethic, and how I think we ought to understand the ethic. And I'm going to offer some suggestions about how we might promote the consistent life ethic in the future, this whole vision of being pro-life for the whole life. The Consistent Life Network has existed as an organization for over 30 years. But our origins go back even further than that, back almost 40 years to 1980, and to an organization called Pro-Lifers for Survival, which combined opposition to abortion with opposition to nuclear weapons and nuclear power. Pro-Lifers for Survival subsequently broadened its mission to embrace defending life against other threats, eventually embracing the defense of life against all 6 of the major threats identified in our mission statement. And reflecting our expanded mission, the name of the group changed to eventually become the Consistent Life Network. In the 30 years since its founding, the network has expanded to include over 200 member groups, most notably Democrats for Life, but also other notable and stereotype-breaking groups such as Feminists for Life, Evangelicals for Social Action, Secular Pro-Life, Feminists Choosing Life of New York, the Pro-Life Alliance of Gays and Lesbians, Rehumanize International, several chapters of Pax Christi, the Catholic Peace Organization, and numerous Catholic worker houses. We try to raise awareness about the consistent life ethic, to let people know that there are philosophical alternatives to left and right, and always to try to combine and to link the life issues. And I have some literature here with me if anybody would like to pick it up. So there's Richard Stith in the front there. He has some, if anyone's interested in learning more. So how do we understand the consistent life ethic? What does it mean to be consistent life as a movement? And I've discovered, from my years of being involved in the Consistent Life Network and activism more broadly, that differences of opinion arise. Somehow this happens in social movements. People tend to disagree about what the consistent life ethic ought to mean, or how we ought to promote it. Now, I think this diversity of opinion is actually a good thing. I think it strengthens the movement. It can give different activists insights into different aspects of threats to life and how best to counter them. And it allows activists to reach and persuade different audiences. What is crucial is to have an understanding of the consistent life ethic that can accommodate this diversity while still retaining a clear and distinct meaning. So I'm going to offer my thoughts on what an appropriate understanding of the consistent life ethic might be, but I first want to offer in a very, very broad brushstrokes fashion my sense of what some of the distinct schools of thought within the movement are on what it means to be consistent life. These different schools of thought are defined by why they oppose the major socially approved killing and deprivation, and the relative priorities they put on the different causes that fall under the consistent ethic of life. So you can see with musical accompaniment. Within the consistent life ethic movement, I would identify at least 4 broad categories of schools of thought. First, there are the absolutists. These are people who hold that killing is inherently wrong in all cases, and that the major socially approved forms of killing humans should be opposed for that simple reason. Simple, straightforward. Now, absolutists differ from the other 3 schools of thought. The other categories of people within the consistent life ethic movement do not necessarily oppose all killing in all cases, although they typically believe all the major threats to life should be ended or dramatically reduced. And they draw distinctions among the different threats to life, opposing these threats for different reasons and taking an absolutist stand against some threats but not others. So the second school of thought that I find tends to come up is what I call the innocent versus guilty school. These might also be called the aggressor versus non-aggressor school. These would be people who draw a distinction between violence that targets those who would be considered innocent in the sense of not harming others, or non-aggressive, and violence that targets those who are guilty, who do harm others, who are aggressive. So the first category, the innocent, the non-aggressors, might include preborn children targeted for abortion, or elderly or disabled people targeted for assisted suicide. People in the second category, the guilty or the aggressor category, might include people on death row who have committed murders or other heinous crimes, or enemy combatants in wartime. People who belong to this school would say, well, forms of killing such as abortion or assisted suicide that kill the innocent are absolutely wrong in principle, all times and all places. Other forms of killing the guilty, people on death row, combatants in war, that's more ambiguous. It can be justified in theory, but people in this school would say, well, we should oppose it in practice. Very often the death penalty in war kill innocent people, whether people who have been wrongfully convicted of crimes, or civilians who are caught in the path of military destruction. And also, of course, war and the death penalty can be quite wasteful and inefficient and costly. So that's another school of thought of how you understand the consistent life ethic. The third school of thought I call forced versus chosen. People who have this interpretation draw a distinction between violence in which the person who is being killed consents to being killed, that would be assisted suicide in theory, and other forms of violence which is coercive, abortion, the death penalty, poverty, and so on. People would say, well, assisted suicide is not wrong in principle because the person is consenting, their freedom is being respected. But people who belong to this school would say, in practice, however, coercion, ableism, discrimination against the elderly and disabled tends to slip into the practice of assisted suicide, and for that reason we should oppose all these forms of killing. And the final school of thought I call oppressor versus oppressed. People in this category draw a distinction between killing that is carried out by a powerful group in society as part of larger systemic oppression, and killing that is carried out by a far less powerful group that is the target of oppression. This distinction separates abortion, which is done at the request, generally at the request of an oppressed group, women, from threats to life such as the death penalty, poverty, or racism, which are oppressive forms of violence by powerful groups, whether men, corporations, a racist criminal justice system. And the distinction here is less clear-cut. People who hold this interpretation, I generally find, would not say that abortion is justified in theory, but rather that it needs to be evaluated in a different way. Their attitude toward abortion differs from the other threats to life because they argue that the women who seek abortions are targets of a larger oppressive system and deserve sympathy and support that those responsible for poverty, racism, the death penalty, and so on do not deserve. All of these different schools of thought, and again, there are variants, these are broad brushstrokes, there are other ways to be a consistent life ethic advocate, reach the same essential conclusion. We ought to work against all these threats to life, although they reach that conclusion for very different reasons. And the differences among these schools of thought can lead to tensions, they can lead to conflict, even within the consistent life ethic movement. And it's partly because of real philosophical differences among the four groups, and it's partly due to differences, I think, in emphasis, rhetoric. People tend to focus on the threats they regard as unambiguously wrong, and they tend to condemn those in the most unambiguous way, whereas they tend to be more measured in condemning the threats that they view as more complex. So for example, those in the innocent versus guilty group, they will talk about abortion more and condemn it more fiercely than they do the death penalty or war, while those in the oppressed versus oppressor school of thought will do the reverse. And these differences also lead to, we all know, to differences in political strategy. Someone of the innocent versus guilty school might say, because abortion is completely, inherently wrong, We have to make it legal, no two ways about it. War, on the other hand, is a more complicated issue. We do, after all, need to maintain our ability to defend ourselves against aggressors. It would be unwise for the United States simply to say unilaterally disarm or withdraw from NATO or a similar organization. We should instead be prudent by carefully using diplomacy to work toward a more peaceful world. Meanwhile, some in the oppressed versus oppressor school might argue, war is completely inherently wrong. It's the product of racism, capitalist exploitation, imperialism. We have to reject it decisively. Abortion, on the other hand, is more complicated. Women facing unplanned pregnancies are placed in an agonizing situation created by a sexist society that does not offer them the real options and support they need. We shouldn't add to their oppression by imposing draconian legal prohibitions on abortion. We should instead be prudent and humane by creating options and support for women that will allow us to reduce the number of abortions over time. Now, both of these hypothetical activists, and it's not purely hypothetical, I have met consistent life ethic activists who more or less espouse the two philosophies I've described. I think they could very well both qualify as consistent life ethic activists. But we can easily see how different their views are and how fiercely they might end up disagreeing with each other about practical steps. And I see this all the time, believe me. So if consistent life ethic activists are to form an effective movement, we need to manage these different approaches to the ethic. I think all the different schools of thought I've described are legitimate ways of advocating for the consistent life ethic. And I think, as I said, that this diversity can help the movement. Precisely because of their different philosophies, the different schools of thought have different insights into these issues. People who hold the oppressed versus oppressor philosophy might be able to see better how abortion is tied up with larger issues of sexism, racism, and poverty that also need to be addressed if we're going to stop abortion. Members of the innocent versus guilty school might be able to appreciate real concerns about security and protecting ourselves against aggression that need to be addressed if we're going to find nonviolent alternatives to war or the death penalty. And this is very important. Members of the different schools are ideally positioned to reach those non-consistent life ethic people who are closest to them philosophically. Members of the oppressed versus oppressor school are better suited to reaching more left-wing or progressive people who are with us on most issues but not on abortion. Members of the innocent versus guilty school are better suited to reaching more right-wing or conservative people who are with us on most issues but not war or the death penalty, say. Members of the coerced versus chosen school are better suited to reaching perhaps more libertarian people who are with us on most issues but not assisted suicide. Each school is more familiar with the different political audience's thinking, can reach them in using arguments and rhetoric that is persuasive to them. So I think we need to recognize the advantages of these different understandings of what it means to be pro-life for the whole life, and we need to some extent, agree to disagree. This means not trying to convert or expel those with different understandings, and it means not being overly concerned with emphasis or rhetoric. We can so easily get tied up in that. Different emphases and rhetoric are a strength of the movement. They allow different types of advocates to engage outside audiences who are with us on some but not all issues. Now I realize that this praise of diverse understandings of the consistent life ethic raises an obvious question. What unites the many different advocates of the consistent life ethic, these different philosophies and schools of thought? Are there some fundamental principles that all these different schools can have in common? And yes, I think there is. Even while we allow for legitimate diversity in belief, the four schools of thought and others can and should unite around some crucial common principles. Here. As I said at the beginning, I think we should all recognize the fundamental value of human life and the importance of respecting and caring for every human life. We should all recognize that violence and other threats to human life and flourishing are tragic and should be prevented. In particular, we should recognize the 6 major socially approved threats to life as serious problems that should be ended. Or, if it is not possible to end them definitively, they should at least be radically reduced. And finally, and this is very important, We should all recognize the importance of challenging the major political parties and political ideologies in the United States today. As I'm sure I don't have to tell the people in this room, neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party, nor for that matter some of the more familiar third parties such as the Greens or the Libertarians, adhere to the consistent life ethic. Even if we adopt a fairly generous definition of what it means to be consistent life, I don't think the standard political parties or ideologies they represent meet that definition. That's not to say that a consistent life ethic advocate could not reasonably decide to belong to or vote for a major political party. In fact, I hope that at least some consistent life advocates do, because we need you in the major parties. But consistent life advocates should be dissidents. They should be the loyal opposition within the parties they belong to. Their role should not be merely to challenge the other folks, the folks on the other side of the political aisle, but the folks on their side as well. Their role should be to cajole, to badger, to nudge their own side closer to the consistent life ethic. In my view, if someone calls himself or herself a consistent life ethic advocate, but is not challenging their own side, if they're happily voting in a partisan fashion straight down the line in one election after another without hesitation, if they're reading or watching or listening to the usual organs of liberal or conservative opinion and don't find themselves, at least sometimes, vehemently disagreeing, I think something's wrong. I think this person is not living up to what it means to be pro-life for the whole life. People who adhere to a consistent life ethic don't have to reject political parties or categories, such as liberal or conservative, but they should not get too comfortable. I won't try to get much more specific than that, because as I said, I think diversity is important, and I wouldn't want to try to prescribe any specific law or policy or strategy as being one that consistent life ethic advocates have to follow. But I can offer a few general thoughts on the kind of steps we should be pursuing in the future. And what we should do in the future to advance the consistent life ethic, I should say at the outset, is not an easy question to answer. Partly because we have such a diverse movement, and partly because how to advance the consistent life ethic effectively in a political climate currently so hostile to it is unclear, to put it mildly. But I will offer a few tentative thoughts. First, I think we need to find a way of defending life that gets away from the usual partisan battles, ways that are creative, sometimes a little indirect. People are so entrenched today in their current political and ideological divisions that trying to advance the cause of life runs into all the predictable opposition. Finding new ways of defending life that does not cause people automatically to throw up barriers or react with hostility is a good approach. I'm sure many of you, for example, saw the story in the New York Times a week or two ago about how people on both sides of the abortion debate came together in South Carolina and Kentucky to enact legislation to protect pregnant women, working mothers in the workplace, provide better accommodations for them. This was a very good measure, inherently good. It defends life against poverty and against sexism and against abortion. That's a good model, that kind of new approach. Another approach I think that can help advance consistent life ethic is for an organization that is associated with one side or another, one ideological camp or another, to endorse some cause or issue it's not usually associated with. There's an organization some of you might have heard of called Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. This is a group of political and social conservatives who work to end the death penalty using specifically conservative arguments. And I'm sure in light of recent news about the death penalty at the federal level, that's something that concerns them, and they have their work cut out for them there. But I think this kind of breaking with part of the usual partisan or ideological expectations is a good approach. First, it interests the media because it has the appeal of a man bites dog style story. And also it might get people to look with fresh eyes at some of these groups. They think, well, I don't agree with these people on anything, but here we are agreeing on this one issue. Maybe there's more here than meets the eye. You can plant a seed. And third, I think we need to find some way of separating advocacy for causes from the usual partisan categories. Or to put it more plainly, we should criticize any and all politicians and political parties who fail to defend life. This approach might seem likely to make us more enemies than friends, and certainly it will make some people unhappy. But I think it'll also help get people away from the relentless us versus them way of thinking. If every time I criticize a Democratic politician, the reaction of any Democrat listening is, uh-oh, this guy's trying to hurt the Democrats and help the Republicans, then I'm not going to get far. And the same applies in reverse, obviously. If I criticize politicians from multiple parties for failing to defend life, or should the wonderful opportunity present itself, if I'm able to praise politicians from multiple parties for succeeding in defending life, and generally make clear that I'm concerned about a cause rather than a party, then that might make people more willing to listen. Not necessarily, but it might. One cause that does cut across the usual ideological categories and that both parties bear a lot of blame is one of the original causes of our organization, working against nuclear weapons. This is still very much a big issue, and one that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are very good on. There's a campaign out there called the Back from the Brink campaign, which I would highly recommend you check out. Consistent Life has endorsed it. It tries to reduce the risk of nuclear war, and maybe some of your organizations would also be willing to endorse it. So those are my thoughts, for whatever they're worth. Let's recognize and respect the diversity of the consistent life ethic as a philosophy. Let's unite around the common principles of respect for human life and the goals of ending or radically reducing abortion, the death penalty, euthanasia, poverty, racism, and war. Rather than getting comfortable in the usual ideological categories, let's shatter them. Let's shatter the ideological categories of left and right. Let's confound people's expectations about what supposedly all pro-lifers or all peace activists or all social justice activists are like. And let's make our voices heard. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Now, if there are any questions for John, you can use the microphone over there.
I have questions.
All right, we have a question.
Thank you very much, John. That was a very, very insightful analysis. Actually, John was, to some degree, reflecting the squabbles that we have on the board of his organization that I'm part of. Each of us represents, I mean, I could give a name to the various weirdos that he says get in arguments with each other and yet remain friends working to try to save lives. So it was just a tremendous insight into personal relations and ideology. I wanted to say a couple of quick things. John referred to me, my name's Richard Stith, as having some literature. I wanted you to see my face so you know you can find me here. These are cards to join Consistent Life as an individual or even preferably as a group. So if you want to catch me sometime, I've got these. And I wanted to say one thing that I think is supplemental to what you said, John. You know, sometimes we think we've got all the arguments on our side and the other side doesn't have any arguments, and so why don't they listen to us? Well, they probably are not listening because they think you are a bad person, or you're an uncouth person, or an uneducated person, or an unsympathetic person. They're using an ad hominem argument against you. So when you show that you're able to agree with them, talk with them, treat them decently, you destroy their best argument, and then they get to hear your good arguments. So actually, bridge building and all that isn't just to be nice and to be happy and to keep society together. It's the best way to convince people to be pro-life on any of these issues.
Thank you, Richard.
I think you can hear me even if it's not on. Okay. Thank you very much. My main question is, are people susceptible to reasoning? You know, I mean, you ask someone, you don't ask them anymore, what do you think about this? It's how do you feel about it? And, so much is driven by emotions or what group you belong to. Are people susceptible to reason?
I think they are, but there are a lot of barriers to get through first. I think what Richard was saying is you need to, first of all, you need to get through the barrier where people think you're just some kind of kook or weirdo. You need to get them to know that you're you. You're a regular person with all the usual quirks. So I think just making friends with people who you don't agree with, and I'm not saying by talking about your disagreements, I just mean get to know people with differing points of view on the life issues. And that brings down a barrier. If you can find some points in common with them, some things you do agree on and you're willing to work with them on, that brings down a barrier. And I think as people get to know each other, they can start to listen and hear each other's arguments. But I think there are obstacles to get through to get to that point, but you can get there. I think making friends is one of the best ways of getting to the point where people will listen to arguments. Is there another question? Hi.
I'm part of a group called the Zeidler Center for Public Discussion. We sit people down in small groups and have them just talk to each other. I wonder if I'm not familiar, I'm kind of new to this whole thing, and I'm wondering if that's an approach that you systematically advocate people to engage in.
Just so I understand, this is you get small groups of people together
over a meal
to talk about.
To talk about things that to get people together with people they normally wouldn't be talking to.
Yeah.
That they often disagree with, and then just have pre-planned questions and a moderator.
Yeah. I think that is fabulous. I think that's very important. And there's been a lot of good work done in similar projects. There's the Public Conversations Project in Boston. There was an initiative done in Washington, D.C. I think it was called the Common Ground Initiative for Life and Choice, which brought together people on different sides of the abortion issue. I think it's tremendously important. And I think the way you're doing it is just the right way to do it, which is a small group, low pressure, over a meal with a moderator. Because when two people of differing views talk in a debate on podiums on a stage like this, you don't hear the arguments. It's just all about showmanship. So yeah, I think that's great, and that's a great way of making our public culture more decent. So thank you for that.
Hey John, thank you very much.
Sure.
If you were to take a poll, how many people would you say are familiar with the term consistent life or consistent life ethic or consistent life network?
Well, I'm sure it's not enough. So I don't know is the short answer. I would certainly say the consistent life ethic is not a concept that is a household word. It's not something that people are familiar with the way they're familiar with being liberal or conservative or even say libertarian. So I think that's something where we need to, I think that just very basic work still needs to be done. It's something we can all help with. But even before we get to the level of how do we change law or how do we change public policy or even how do we change other people's minds is how do we get people to know that we're here, that this philosophy exists. And yeah, I think just trying to publicize the concept is very important, and certainly there's a lot more that needs to be done there.
I think one difficulty is since it's a partisan atmosphere, when you say you're pro-life, there's all these presumptions.
Right.
They say I'm pro-life, oh, you're just pro-birth, you don't want to take care of the children after they're born, you want to put kids in cages, and no,
Right.
that's
Right.
absolutely what I'm about.
Yeah. How do we get past that? Yeah. Well, oddly enough, we have, in many ways, a better opportunity to break that stereotype now than we've had for a while, because one of the most delicious man bites dog stories, no pun intended, to the media today is, oh hey, these people you think would support Trump, they're not supporting him. So look at these conservatives who don't support Trump. Look at these pro-lifers who don't support Trump. Look at these, evangelical Christians who don't support Trump. The media love stories like that. And I remember during 2016, several of our member groups, pro-life feminist groups that opposed Trump but were still very much pro-life, got a very flattering story done in Slate on them, which I think that sort of story is what the media likes, because they have their own partisan reasons for it, of course, but it gives us exposure. So I think we actually have an opportunity, and I think as you say, the kids in cages crisis, the mistreatment of immigrants at the southern border, I think seeing pro-life and consistent life, whole life groups, as Democrats for Life has done, take a stand against that, that starts to help break those stereotypes, and people like that. Certain partisan people like that because it serves their purposes, but it gives us media attention too. All right. Well, I've hogged the microphone enough. Ken, you can take over. Thank you all.